Okay, I guess before I start, I should probably make you guys aware of where I'm coming from today, and that is from the biblical perspective of an old earth, okay? An earth that's 6,000 years old, just a little bit older. Now, if that age doesn't sound very old to you, I might suggest that it's because you've been specially trained from the time you were little, just like I was, in terms of thinking about millions and billions of years when we see earth history. And so today we're going to peel back the curtain just a little bit and take a look at the ways in which the secular world has come up with some of these advanced ages for the earth. But before we talk about that, I wanted to review a couple of important concepts from my first talk that people can have in mind as we go through today. The idea of natural selection and mutation. And those two terms go together because they're the only game in town for evolution to have possibly worked. And they're a demonstrably false mechanism for evolutionary progress. It's a failed mechanism, and people need to understand that. So something just happened here. Okay, we're back. So in terms of natural selection, it's just what it sounds like, okay? You're selecting traits that are pre-existing. There's no new information that's being created in this process. And whether we're talking about natural selection or artificial selection, think of those as kind of the same. Artificial is when you as a human being are thinking about the selection process and kind of guiding it, sort of maybe controlling a few of the parameters to speed the process up. So for an example, let's say you're interested in plants and you want to be a plant breeder, and you're interested in creating a variety of wheat that has a bigger head of grain on it because you have the noble goal of wanting to help feed the world. And you spend 20 years between the lab and the field, and you're crossbreeding wheat varieties to generate a bigger head of wheat. And after 20 years, you succeed, and you release it to the world. Well, give yourself a pat on the back. You've done something really good. But you also know from your knowledge of genetics and personal experience that if you carried your work out from here till eternity, you're never going to get a head of wheat that's as big as a pineapple. And you're not going to get a stalk that can support it either. And just like with animal selection, okay? Maybe you love animals. Maybe it's dogs. Not just any dogs, maybe you love big dogs. But that German Shepherd you got at home just isn't cutting it anymore for you, and you want to go bigger. Well, you start going out and you find the biggest dog in the neighborhood, and you crossbreed it with your German Shepherd. And you go and you look at all the puppies, and when they grow up, you pick the biggest dog out of there, and you start breeding them, okay? And so this process can go on for 20-some years. And at the end of this process, lo and behold, you've created something that you're very happy with. It looks like a Saint Bernard, but it doesn't drool. You've done the world a huge favor. You've made a big improvement there, okay? You've selected something else. But you also know that if you continued your work out from here to eternity, you're never going to end up with Clifford the Big Red Dog. Okay, you're not going to get a dog that's as big as a house. You're not going to get a dog that's as big as an elephant. Because you see, that's what the selection process does. It helps you to evaluate the ranges of diversity that you can get within a created kind of animal. And you're getting a look at those ranges, Chihuahuas to whatever, but you're not going to go past that, because using the analogy of a deck of cards, what you're seeing with these is just a unique, special hand that's been dealt out to you, all right? And you're not creating any new cards in this process, and selection has no ability to do that. Evolution demands that there somehow be new cards introduced to the deck. Okay, and in genetics, when you're dealing with DNA, it's a very, very large deck of cards that you have to choose hands from, but it's still a very finite group of cards. And so back when Darwin promoted his theory, he made a lot of predictions about the fossil record. He said that if my theory is true, we should be able to find all these transitional animals in the fossil record between one kind of animal and another. And they weren't finding any of that after looking for 50 or 60 years. They still haven't found much in that way today. They make some arguments, but by and large, that's not what the fossil record shows. And so the theory was, in the early 1900s, the theory was really getting questioned by some of the intellectuals, and they were working on a way to rescue it, and they kind of discovered this process known as mutation. And they started experimenting and realizing that DNA can kind of change. And they thought, well, hey, this is it. If we combine into this theory of evolution this idea of mutations, then we can rescue this before they knew a whole lot about mutations. So let's take a look here. You guys, this is known as the Human Genome Mutation Database. You can go visit there if you're feeling too happy someday and you want to just come down a little bit. It's got a list of over 500,000 diseases caused by mutations in people, okay? Mutations are making us sick. They're tearing us down. It's actually pretty sad, but I've stayed away from this website for a couple of months, and I came back and I realized there were 1,000 more entries in that short time. And so if you kind of, to get an idea of how this works, your body's made up of individual cells, about 37 trillion of them, okay? And they have their own internal lifespans, and so they'll die out eventually and need to be replaced. And when they're getting ready to do that, they divide and they copy their DNA. And during that process, unfortunately, there's a few mistakes that are made that get through the system of correction. And so you end up accumulating errors in the instruction manual that tells your cells how to do what they need to do. And as we get older and we go through more cell divisions, these mutations build up in our bodies. And they're responsible for up to 50% of the aging process. That's why we don't look the same when we're 20 as we do when we're 80. And it also happens that these mutations accumulate in our reproductive cells as well. And so we end up passing mutations on to the next generation. I'm more mutant than my parents' generation. My children are more mutant than me. And that's what it's going to be like until Jesus comes back, okay, to save us from extinction. But you see, natural selection cannot deal with these little mutations that are building up in our bodies because it has to take you as an entire individual or not at all, okay? So unfortunately, we see children who die shortly after birth because their mutation load was too high and they don't live to pass on those severe defects to the next generation. But we are slowly going downhill from the mutations that we cannot get rid of, and we accumulate those through the years. So Adam and Eve, they had perfect genetics, okay? And it's been all downhill since that time. It's known as genetic entropy. Some good books written on that. Good website, and you can do that. But if you look at the list, there's about 10 different kinds of mutations that you can get. And you'll recognize these names like small deletions and small insertions and gross insertions. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because if I grab my Bible and I open it up randomly here and I start crossing out a letter here, crossing out a letter there, adding a word here that doesn't belong, adding another nonsense word somewhere else that doesn't belong, maybe double copying a paragraph. Does that make the message more clearer? No, the instruction manual, the book is getting harder to read. And so as this process continues generation after generation, the message is getting less clear and we can't do anything about it. So that's the nature of mutations, okay? All right, well, welcome to today's talk. Rocks, fossils, and fraud, oh my. So in my first talk, we focused mainly on biology, but there's a couple of disciplines, geology and cosmology, that tend to support biology. They attempt to, and a lot of it has to do with the interpretation of data from these that seem to support long ages since creation, okay? But today we're going to focus mostly on geology and some of the related things like paleontology. But let's start out by asking, how do we know how old something is? We can look at something and say, yeah, it's old, but to know exactly how old it is, how is it that we know? How do you know how old you are? Well, you got this thing called a birth certificate. And I don't remember being born. I'm actually very grateful for that. But, I can refer back to this birth certificate because there were eyewitnesses there to my having been born, and they signed their names on the bottom. And so that's a great reference. So if you really want to know how old something is, you need a reliable witness testimony, okay? Somebody had to be there to see that. And thankfully with the Bible, the Creator himself has revealed to us, the age of the earth and cosmos through the scriptures. That's a whole nother talk too. But anyway, let's talk about how old the earth is according to evolutionists, all right? This number has been evolving. Well, in 1770, George Buffon, the French zoologist, told his audience that it was 70,000 years old. Now, people had a pretty good biblical worldview still back then, so that's not a number that shocks us today, but to his audience, that was a big deal. But in 1905, the age of the earth was officially considered 2 billion years old. But by 1969, they declared it was 3.5 billion years old. So in 64 years, the earth managed to age 1.5 billion years. You guys think you're getting old fast. Today, the students are taught that it's about 4.5 billion years old. That's the standard secular viewpoint, okay? And that means that the earth's been getting older at the rate of 17.8 million years per year for the last 255 years. Okay, and so how they work that out? The ages of millions of years are all calculated by assuming that the rates of changes of processes that we see today or in the past were the same as that we observe today, okay? And that's called the principle of uniformitarianism. Try saying that one 10 times quickly. But what it's about is it's denying the global flood of Noah's day about 4,500 years ago. Okay, so technically uniformitarianism is the underlying dogma of modern secular geology that insists that present processes are sufficient to explain the formation of the rock record that we see. Okay, totally out of hand, discounting the biblical account of Noah's flood. So what they're referring to here is the rock formation, okay? So you can start anywhere you want on the chart. Start in the mountains. You think about the glaciers and the elements wearing down the rock, grinds it up into soil. The sediments get transported through wind and water downhill. They end up on both land and in the ocean basins. The Earth's plate is the Earth's surface is made up of plates. You have oceanic and continental plates, and eventually, after these sediments have turned into rock, the plates, the ocean plates get subducted underneath the lighter, less dense continental plates, and you get the whole process over again with uplift and volcanism. And admittedly, it's a very, very slow process that we witness today. But that you have to discount what's being told to you in the Bible about the events of the global flood. And so at this point, some people in the audience are probably thinking, but wait a minute, Darin, wait a minute. That's the original old way. And so I need to address this little elephant in the room, the one that's known as radiometric dating, okay? So with radiometric dating, even though it's a more modern method of dating rocks that seem to give ages of billions of years, it's very problematic. And all they're doing is they're taking the radioactive elements found in rocks that degrade into what they call daughter elements, and they're measuring, and they know how long that takes from their half-life, and then they measure the ratios of those, and they try to work out how much time has passed from the beginning. But there's some assumptions that cause really big problems. And first of all, long-age geologists will not accept a radiometric date unless it matches their pre-existing expectations, what is previously believed. A lot of times they'll send a rock sample in to get analyzed, and they'll get a date back that they don't like, and they'll just sort of put that information on the shelf and go with the standard. No, you have to assume what radioactive element amounts were in the rock when it formed. You can't go back and know that for certain, okay? And so that's a huge assumption. And also, this whole process assumes that the radioactive decay rate of elements has remained constant over time. And when this first came out, that seemed like a very, very reasonable assumption. But it turned out later on that it wasn't. We now know from recent research, and I'll tell you where you can find that later, that the Earth underwent a period of rapid nuclear decay. And we don't know why that happened exactly, but we think we know when. Back during the flood of Noah's day. So the results are constantly wrong with rocks of known age analyzed. So why should we trust the results from rocks of unknown age? You see, here in our own state, we have Mount St. Helens, and a few decades ago, they went and they took some rock that they watched emerge from the lava dome there, and they knew it was 20 years old, okay? The rock was 20 years old. They split it up into a few sections. They sent it off to multiple laboratories, and they waited to get the results back. The 20-year-old rock from one laboratory was dated at over 1,000 years old. Another laboratory had it at hundreds of thousands, and there was another one that dated at over 1 million years. So I think you can at least begin to see the problems in using these radiometric dating methods. Carbon-14 is the other one that you hear about, right? Everyone's heard of carbon-14, another radioactive element that they use to measure the passage of time in organisms that were once living, carbon-based organisms. Carbon-14 has a relatively short half-life compared to the others, and so it doesn't work for extensive periods of time. But it too has its own problems. Here's a freshly killed seal that was carbon dated as having died 1,300 years ago, okay? And a snail shell. It was carbon dated as 27,000 years old. Now that's a slow-growing shell there. I wish my fingernails grew that slowly. So let's take a look at the additional problem. You guys recognize these? What do they all have in common? Well, they're all found deep inside the earth. They're all carbon-based materials, lots of hydrocarbons there. In the case of diamond, it's solid carbon, the hardest substance on earth. And the secularists, the uniformitarians will tell you that these things are millions and millions of years old. So the one thing that they shouldn't have in common, but they do, is that they all contain radioactive carbon-14. You see, after about 80,000 years of time, you shouldn't be able to detect any carbon-14 because after a creature dies, it quits incorporating carbon-14 into its body and it starts degrading from there. And so I'm not saying that these things are that old. I'm just saying that we can measure decent levels of radioactive carbon in every sample of coal, diamond, crude oil, and natural gas from around the world. Every sample that's ever been taken and analyzed has come up with carbon-14. And that is proof that these things are not millions of years old. And they always claim contamination, but with diamond, that's the hardest substance on earth. You can't get contamination inside a diamond lattice crystal. So anyway, if you guys want a serious treatment on the topic, here's a couple of great books sitting on the back desk there you can look at, and I recommend they're great reading for everyone interested in a serious topic there, and it'll go through in a lot more detail than I have time for. Okay, so I need to set the stage here for how we got this shift in thinking away from the biblical chronology of things into the modern day one. So we had these conflicts between Catholics and Protestants during the 16th and 17th centuries. There was 100 years spent with these groups battling each other, okay? And they estimate 5 to 10 million people died in these battles. Either as a direct result of battle or a consequence of famine afterwards and those sorts of things. But the important thing to remember is that all the major European countries and their languages had the Bible, at least major portions of it, written by 1550, okay? The printing press was invented in 1440, so the common people could have their own Bibles in their own language. And when they started reading the words of Jesus and understanding his teachings, and they contrasted that with all the crazy battles going on in Europe with millions of people dying, the hypocrisy was very palpable. And I think that really did a lot to the intellectual communities too. And so moving on into the Enlightenment period from the 17th century to the 19th, you have some of these figures like John Locke and Voltaire, David Hume. You might recognize some of these. Now, these guys were very influential thinkers of their time. Some of them were liberal Christians. Some of them were agnostics and deists, and others were just outright aggressive atheists, but they shared a few things in common, including the distrust of authority, and particularly church authority, and skepticism. They're very skeptical people. They promoted reason, but skepticism. That skepticism carried over into the biblical text as well. Okay, so if these guys were around today, they'd be known as social media influencers. They'd have millions of followers on TikTok and Instagram. Okay, so it was a big deal. So then we get into these times when we have James Hutton and Charles Lyell, the fathers of modern geology. James Hutton, he promoted the whole uniformitarianism thing, and then Charles Lyell, he's famous for blending together the idea of uniformitarianism with the principle of the geologic column. We'll talk about that next. And of course, Charles Darwin, we know what he's famous for. He was heavily influenced by Charles Lyell and his book. He wrote this book, The Principles of Geology, a 3-volume book where he did what I said before. He combined the idea of the geologic column with this principle of uniformitarianism. So what exactly is this geologic column? Okay, as we look around the surface of the earth everywhere, we see these layers of rock, okay? So we have these distinctive layers of rock that started out as sediments carried by running water that piled up, and they formed rock over time. And the bottom layers are older than the upper layers, which are younger, okay? Nobody argues with that. We just argue about how much time it took to get there. So the simpler fossils tend to be found in the lower layers as a pattern, and the more complex fossils are found in the upper layers, okay? So that's a general pattern with plenty of exceptions. But secular geologists have assigned ages to the rock layers depending on which fossils are found there. And those are called index fossils. So that's the nature of the geologic column. You're tying a rock layer with an index fossil. And then you get into the 1800s, and each one of these layers was given a name, like Jurassic. Everybody knows that name from the movies, right? An age and this index fossil. And you can see this general trend from the chart. The lower layers, which they assume to be, millions of years in age, different than the upper layers, have these simple marine life organisms. And as you progress up, you get more complex plants and then animals, and then with humans on the top. And so when evolutionists look at this geologic column, they see evolution. They think these animals evolved. And that's why we see this progression, this order. But first of all, that is what we call circular reasoning when they look at it this way, because they use the rock layers to date the fossils, but then they'll turn around in other places and they'll use the fossils to date the rocks. Let me give you an example of this logical fallacy and how it works, okay? The circular reasoning claim. This rock layer is 150 million years old. Question, how do you know that? Because it contains Ammonite X, which lived 150 million years ago. Well, how do you know Ammonite X lived 150 million years ago? Well, because it's found in rock layers that are 150 million years old. Okay, so that's classic circular reasoning, and we see that. And here's an admission from Encyclopedia Britannica, not exactly a Christian publication. It says, and this is written by a geologist, a secular geologist, it cannot be denied that from a strictly philosophical standpoint, geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the remains of the organisms that they contain. All right, enough on that one. So, from a biblical perspective, there's other ways of looking at this order that we find in the fossil record. All right? And the one I happen to like the best is the ecological order. See, the Bible tells us that in the beginning of the flood, the early stages, the fountains of the great deep were opened up, and we think that happened in the ocean basins. And that would have expelled out huge amounts of sediment and water at the same time. And that would explain that the marine organisms are, getting buried first, and then as the flood waters rose higher and higher, it reaches the mainland, and then you're going to bury the coastline dwellers and the swamp people, swamp critters. And then, of course, the creatures on the mainland that can run away from advancing waters, they're going to look for higher ground, and they're going to get buried last. So that fits the picture that we're seeing quite nicely as well, since we know evolution is impossible. So, you see, if you look in the textbooks, you get this picture of all these layers, one on top of each other. But the truth of the matter is, there's not a single location in the world that contains more than 3 consecutive periods that are in the proper order. You see, they try to correlate these rock layers with fossils in order to date them, and sometimes the fossils aren't there, or there's different fossils, they're out of place. And then there's the trouble of actually saying, with positivity that, this rock layer over in North America looks similar to the one over in England. We're just going to say it's the same because we think it is. So really, it's just a theoretical construct, okay? But, unfortunately, although the geologic column doesn't exist except in the textbooks and the minds of the people who believe it, People who believed in it changed their worldview away from biblical flood geology to uniformitarianism. That's the sad result. But let's talk more about fossils here, okay? 95% of all fossils were shallow marine organisms, okay? That's the easiest to cover up. And 95% of the remaining 5% were algae, plants, trees, and other invertebrates like bugs. The remaining 25% were vertebrates, and most of those were fish. So, it's in some ways it's a miracle that we got a record of some of these extinct animals as it is, and we're not just looking at a bunch of clamshells. But still, people ask the question, where are all the human fossils? I mean, Darin, if you're telling me that people lived alongside all these extinct animals, including dinosaurs, how can we find dinosaur bones, but we don't find any humans? Well, we do find some humans, but it's a tricky situation. We don't have all the answers, but you know what? If we think about things, if we're generous and we assume that there's 10 million people alive at the time of the flood, and we divide this number by the 700 million cubic kilometers of sediment that have eroded off the surface of the earth as well as being deposited in places that we can account for, we only have one human for every 70 cubic kilometers of rock. That makes like looking for a needle in a haystack very easy. That's a much easier task. And keep in mind that water is covering 71% of the surface of the planet. So, we don't have the ability to go and do geologic excavations underneath the sea. We can go to the bottom at times, but we can't be doing archaeology there or what have you. So guess what? Having said that, here's a human footprint fossil that was verified, found in 1968 in Utah. And this is somebody who was wearing some sort of footwear like shoes that stepped on a trilobite, okay? Now, the interesting thing about this is the rock layer dated by uniformitarianism that this footprint was found in was dated to be 500 million imaginary years ago, okay? So that's a problem for the long-agers. And, of course, no natural history museum in the world wanted this wonderful fossil, so it ended up in a creation museum in Texas where you can find it. But still, it makes you wonder, how do evolutionists deal with concrete evidence, rock-solid evidence like this? Well, they invent stories, okay? They say, maybe aliens visited the planet and stepped on a trilobite, all right? I guess that's what you have to do, or, you just ignore it. But here's another example. I found some fossil human hands next to a marine dinosaur in a layer. This is from Argentina. And here we have this rock that's been dated at 100 million years old, and those are real human handprints there. And so humans truly did live with dinosaurs in the not too distant past. So I want you guys to think about water for just a minute, how much water we have on this planet. This is an image of Earth where they've removed the clouds so you can get a better appreciation. There's New Zealand down in the lower left and Central America in the upper right. But it's fascinating. I found some good verses here. In Genesis 1:2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And then we have, they willfully ignore this from 2 Peter 3:5. Long ago, the heavens and the earth were brought about from water and through water by the word of God. And I'm sure glad he gave us this much water because it helps keep our temperatures low on the earth. And in Genesis 7:11, we read, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the same day, were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Now, I don't know if this means anything or not, but I find it interesting that the fountains of the great deep are the first things to be mentioned rather than the 40 days of rain. And I think I got a couple slides here that I want to show you that I think you'll find fascinating. So back in 2014, the journal Science published an article called Dehydration Melting at the top of the lower mantle. But what had happened is these geophysicists had discovered this huge pool of water beneath the Earth's surface, and they were trying to investigate and figure out what this was all about. And so this geophysicist, Steve Jacobson, he was one of the ringleaders of this study. He found a mineral that's called ringwoodite, and it acts like a sponge and it soaks up water. And so where this is located, this ringwoodite is the high-pressure form of olivine, magnesium silicate, that occurs 520 to 660 kilometers beneath the surface of the earth in the transition zone. So in between the upper mantle and the lower mantle, which is about 500 kilometers beneath your feet, there's this sponge that goes all the way around the earth in this zone, about 140 kilometers thick, which is like almost 90 miles or something. And the interesting thing is that it wasn't until just last year, 2024, that they were able to actually quantify the amount of water they think is down there. And it's considered to be 2.5 times the volume of water that we have on all the oceans of the surface. So when I thought about it, I thought, I'm really grateful that God shut the fountains of the deep off at some point in time, because we'd all have to evolve into fish. So there's a lot of water here, folks, a lot of waters. And then we read, at your rebuke, from Psalms 104:7-8, the waters fled at the sound of your thunder and hurried away. Mountains rose and valleys sank to the place you established for them. Now, I know this psalm is more directed towards the actual creation of the earth, but I think it holds true for the events of the flood as well. People sometimes say, you really think that Mount Everest was covered with the global flood? No, I really don't think Mount Everest was in existence at that time, or any other mountain in the Himalayas. You see, you can go throughout the Himalayas and you can find clamshells even at the top of Mount Everest. So we know that, it was a shallow ocean at one time. All the Himalayas were, and they were uplifted. And we have, as creationists, we have models to explain this. During the flood, when the fountains of the deep were broken up, we have this catastrophic plate tectonics that rapidly shifted the continents and pushed up a lot of the mountain ranges that we see today. And so there are other explanations. So a lot of times when we're dealing with secular versus biblical geology, we're just arguing about the time frame. So let's talk dinosaur fossils. Everybody loves dinosaurs, and they're a lot more interesting than clam fossils. All right, well, back in 1997, they made an amazing discovery that this medical pathologist found red blood cells in dinosaur bone. Now, that was quite concerning to the community, because these things aren't supposed to last that long. And then Dr. Mary Schweitzer published work in 2005 that was she was shunned horribly for finding lots of soft tissues, proteins, just spongy things inside T-Rex bones in this formation over in Montana. And that was quite a surprise to these people, long agers, because honestly, these structures are not supposed to have that kind of longevity. Maybe 100,000 years, but not 65 million years. Okay, so that was quite a shock. But these things were found, and to a reasonable person, you'd understand that this is we're talking about an animal that's been buried for thousands of years and not millions. But and they've continued to find more of these types of finds in other parts of the world, including South America and Asia, and even up in Alberta, Canada. So it's out there in a lot, and so it shows that this Earth is not nearly as old as they claim it is. And then we have this other problem here called polystrate fossils. All right. Poly means many, and straight means it refers to the strata. So we have these trees, these fossilized trees embedded all around the world, and they have sediments that have built up around them, supposedly. They're embedded in these sediments, and we're told that these sediment layers are vastly different in age, okay? That's a problem, folks. So the evolutionist only has two choices to solve that dilemma, okay? The trees either stood upright for millions of years while the sediment layers formed around them, or the trees grew through hundreds of feet of solid sedimentary rock looking for sunlight. Okay, well, there's a better way of looking at it. The trees were buried in an upright big flood. Folks, it takes a lot of water to make layers that thick. And that's something that can't be overlooked. And you only get that kind of waters from a giant flood. So let's talk about living fossils for a minute. What are they? Well, living fossil is a term used to describe a living species that has remained relatively unchanged for over the supposed millions of years period, as seen in the fossil record, right? Horseshoe crabs, ginkgo trees, nautilus. We got two sea creatures here. They tell you that they're from fossils that are up to 500 million years old. So what's going on here? Evolution was a theory that was supposed to explain how microbes became microbiologists over billions of years and explain all this change that we see, and yet they never thought that they were going to have to explain non-change. All right, but they've come up with fancy terms for it, like stasis and punctuated equilibrium. Sounds very technical, but the fact of the matter is, any theory that purports to, explain everything is not a theory at all. That's philosophy, folks. So here we have lobe-finned fishes, another example. They are index fossils for 300 to 400 million year old rock. All right, everybody's heard the story of this fish called the coelacanth. Here we have this fish that you can find in a lot of the warm tropical oceans of the south. But it looks the same today as it did from the fossil record, okay? This fish did not change one bit from the time it was preserved because there hasn't been time for it to change. There's been no selection going on. Here's one of my favorite living fossils. It's known as the Willemia tree. I like this one because this picture was taken from my front yard. I'm the proud owner of the rarest tree on earth. It was only known from the fossil record until 1996, and they found a group of these trees growing in a box canyon in Australia, and they went and identified it. I guess it didn't die out 200 million years ago, and it looks the same today as it did then, and it does that because the years are imaginary. Here's some other fossils that you guys might recognize: ducks, beavers, badger, platypuses. Is that the plural? Platypi? Platypuses? Okay. Pine trees and squirrels look the same today as they did when they dated these fossils. Now, what these all have in common is they're all found in rock layers that are dated from the time of the dinosaurs. You see, these modern day animals lived beside dinosaurs just like people did. They don't like to tell you that. When you go into your local museum of natural philosophy, history, and you go into the dinosaur exhibit, you should realistically expect to see something that looks like this, okay? Mallard ducks flying overhead, beavers and squirrels, but they will never do that because they're trying to maintain the illusion of great age. If people saw beavers hanging out with T-Rexes and squirrels running around climbing pine trees, it would totally destroy that image, and people would start to question. And then, of course, my questions for them is, if these layers are all different ages, then why are there no erosion marks between the layers? You tell me you got one layer on top of another that's like 2,000 years apart, and I don't see any erosion from one layer to the next. And then I know something about soil formation. Why are there no soil layers between these rock layers? There should have been some soil formation. We should be able to see that, but we don't. By and large, we do not. And here's a cross-section of the Grand Canyon, okay? And if you're standing on the north rim, you're standing on the Kaibab limestone, okay? And they'll tell you that layer is 250 million years old. But if you go down 4,000 feet beneath your feet, you reach the bottom of the sedimentary layers, and that's the Tapete sandstone. They'll tell you it's 550 million years old. So you right in 4,000 feet of rock, you've got a 300 million year difference in age, okay? But the Grand Canyon has a fault in there, a couple of faults, and so the basement rock has cracked and shifted, and it's moved, and it has bent these layers. This 4,000-foot layer piece of rock has been bent and reshaped and curved. And the interesting thing about that is when you go in and you look at the mineral grains that make up the rocks, you don't see any kind of signs of stretching and stress that you would see if the sediments had become rock when the uplift occurred and the downlift occurred. And the same is true for the cementing agents. You don't find any cracks. There's no cracks in that. So, it's like Play-Doh. When you have soft Play-Doh, you can mold it to the shape that you want, but you put it out in the sun for the day and you come back and you try to bend it. What does it do? It cracks and breaks and crumbles. And so what we know from looking at this is that these layers had to have been laid down in quick succession in order to still be what they call plastic and moldable in order to fold like this without cracking. Now, I don't know how long it takes to dry out rock, but it's not, these layers are not millions of years apart. Those years are imaginary. All right. And we see this all over the world in places, okay? We find examples of this folding where the layers had to have been in a plastic state, laid down in quick succession, and then undergoing folding before turning into rock. And here's some extreme folding and doubling over, okay? This thing was so folded it doubled over on itself. I think that's a pretty cool example. And then, you guys, if you want to deep dive into why the earth is young, please go to this site, creation.com, and type in 101 reasons the earth is young, and they can give you answers to all the questions that you might have about the things that I didn't have time to cover today. So thank you guys for paying attention. Have a great day.